Alexa Donne here, and today I am finally, at long last, going to talk all about story structure. Specifically, 3-act structure, because it is the one I am most familiar with. It's the most common one for people to follow anyway, and I have put off this video for a very, very long time because talking about structure is a lot. As you may know, I am a pantser, though I kind of fall in the middle now, and that's the thing. I am not a fan of rigidly following structure in the sense of like planning and outlining and kind of learning and like this is how you do it. I have ingested over many years things about structure, and I have found things that click into place for me about story structure, and it's kind of like in my system, and I am able to write to structure without rigidly planning ahead of time for that structure. But I recognize everyone has a different kind of writing style and story style and learning style, and at long last I was like, it's time for me to just batten down the hatches and formally talk about structure. And so the dual-pronged disclaimer I want to give up front. First of all, take and leave what does and doesn't work for you. I'm a firm believer that generally when it comes to storycraft and whatnot, that it's all about kind of finding whatever clicks into your brain and makes you go, aha, that is how a story works. And that can actually also evolve and change over time. Some of the things I'm going to share here, some of the visual tools and like names for things I'm going to use are the things that have clicked and worked for me. And I will mention things that you can investigate on your own that might help it click into place for you, and that might actually not be 3-act structure. There are other ways to formally structure your novel. And the second disclaimer is just not to mistake the concept of outlining, of planning your stories ahead of time as the only way to follow story structure. The most important thing is, regardless of your writing style or how overwhelming you might find story structure, is to take at least the bare minimum steps to understand it or parts of it to try to improve your work. Over time, you should find your work improving regardless of your writing process, as long as you are being mindful of story structure. Whether that is you're going to follow 3-act structure, 4-act structure, 5, follow a beat sheet, snowflake method, the Dan Harmon story circle, whatever that means for you. Let's start with story structure basics. All stories have to have a beginning, middle, and an end. That is just a story arc. Your character will start somewhere, something big is going to happen to the middle that leads to a big climax, and then you'll have a finale. Now, of course, because it's beginning, middle, end, it lends itself quite naturally to a 3-act structure, and it's why we mostly talk about 3-act structures. Also because 3-act structures are really popular in screenwriting. They're kind of the norm in screenwriting, and we're just all super duper accustomed to them. But it's of course not as simple as a beginning, middle, and an end. There's a ton of stuff that goes within that and beats to the story structure and things to consider, and that is what I will be going over. Both the fundamentals of 3-act story structure and key story beats to keep in mind. I have personally found that looking at story beats and the critical story beats that align nicely with 3-act structure have helped me the most in figuring out story structure and following it as a pantser. So let's start with 3-act structure basics. Act 1 is your beginning, your setup. It's going to be approximately 25 to 30% of your story, the first third of your story. You have exposition, setting up the status quo, your main character, their world, what they want, and then you're going to throw an inciting incident at them, which is the catalyst of change and is going to lead your character to having to make some sort of decision. That decision will be the beginning of change and will inevitably propel them into the plot. So then Act 2 is your middle. It's actually going to be the longest part of your book and honestly is the trickiest to get right because naturally it's the longest, you have the most to do, and it's a delicate game of pacing, and they've made their decision, your character, they're going on the journey, the thing is happening, the plot is happening. You're going to have action rising to a midpoint where something big, some sort of twist, some sort of shift and change of perspective for your main character is going to happen, which will inevitably propel them downhill to your climax, which is going to be in Act 3. This section is going to have both fun and games, which is a beat we're going to talk about later, but also a lot of conflict. Obstacles. The character's going to have things to react to. You'll have things called reversals, which I'm going to talk a bit more about, setbacks essentially. And one way I have seen it described that I personally liked is in the first half of Act 2 leading up to your midpoint, your character should be reactive, and then after the midpoint, which is some sort of epiphany for that character, they should be more proactive, and that is what barrels them toward the third act. Now, I'm going to do an entire video on two concepts that are going to be critical in your second act, which are pinch points and reversals, but in brief here. Pinch points, you're usually going to have two of them, one at the beginning of your Act 2, or kind of at the beginning of your Act 2. It's actually a little after your fun and games, but before your midpoint, and toward the end / sometimes a little bit into Act 3, into the break, into 3. Pinch points are a reminder of the antagonist's power, that whatever that external force driving the conflict is, that remind your character and the reader what is at stake. These pinch points should lead directly or indirectly to some sort of realization for your character that kind of changes how they are approaching things. It is a propulsion point forward in the story. They should essentially lead to choices. Reversals can factor into these because a pinch point can be a reversal, but not all reversals are pinch points. Reversals are reversals of fortune, a turn of events, or a little twist that changes the direction, and also leads to kind of either a rise or fall in emotion in your reader. So essentially, if things are going really well for your character, or kind of a series of things, which is why often that pinch point right after the fun and games is a reversal. Things are going well, and then you're going to do something to have a reversal of fortune, a setback, often from that antagonistic external force to remind the reader what is at stake. And whatever that reversal is going to lead to the next character and plot point. And it's push and pull and push and pull throughout your Act 2. You should have a decent number of reversals throughout your Act 2. It's all about rising and falling tension. And through that rise and fall of tension, and I mentioned reactive in the first half, you have a twist and epiphany in the middle that leads to your character having a realization, and then they become more proactive. You're having reversals and back and forth and pinch points, which bring you to Act 3. Again, a beat I will talk more about, which is the break into 3. Just like at the beginning of Act 2, your character has to make a choice, but unlike the choice they made in Act 1 to get into Act 2 of whether or not to go on the journey, and I mean, they have to decide to go on the journey or your plot doesn't happen. In Act 3, they have to make some kind of decision, whether they are aware of what that decision means or not, that inevitably propels them toward the climax and the finale. It's the point of no return moment. So in that Act 3, which will be the final third of your book, 70%, and thus your Act 2 is going to be a nice 40% chunk of your book, approximately. And that third act is all about your climax, your big confrontation, all the realizations, and then you're going to nicely resolve things in your finale, though before that you should have a denouement, which we are going to talk a bit about in some of the other structures. So that is the interesting thing. 3-act structure is very kind of straightforward. Ba, 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 and it can tend to skip over some things that I personally do find important in storytelling, though you will or can find them in beats. But I just want to throw out that note that one thing I do like about some other kinds of story structure, and thus looking into them might unlock something for you as a writer. I do like that 5-act story structure gives an entire act to the denouement, which does kind of warm my heart. It is one of my favorite things that I find often is skipped at the end of books. It's like breathing room between your climax and your finale. And so, as I mentioned, 3-act structure is just wildly popular. It tends to be the most common one, the most talked about, because I generally think it's pretty easy to follow. A beginning, a middle, and an end, and then there's lots of different kind of pit stops along the way. And I've definitely kind of evolved in how I've approached 3-act structure, so I'm going to share some of the things that have been helpful for me, and also just mention a few things that I don't personally use, but might be the storytelling act structure approaches, techniques that will unlock things for you. So the first way that I just generally approach 3-act structure that can still be very, very useful is a literal story arc. I call it a story curve, and I learned this from a live journal post from Jim Butcher, and he said literally get a piece of paper and draw an arc on it. Then you're going to divide it into sections, and that is 3-act structure. And that's something that really helped me in my first couple of books when I did feel very overwhelmed by structure. So honestly, you can approach it in a very boiled down basic sense if you are overwhelmed by all of the moving pieces that come into story structure. The next thing I got into that was probably the big revelation for me, the thing that definitely helped me a lot, is story beats. And the most famous one is Save the Cat Method, the Blake Snyder beat sheet, which was originally written for screenwriters. And that is the one I personally read and still the beats that I tend to kind of quote and follow. But happily in that time, there has been a version for Novelists that has been written, an official version for Novelists. And there's a reason you hear everyone on AuthorTube recommend this. It is genuinely a really great book. Jessica Brody wrote it, and a great system. It's a great way of breaking down and understanding story structure and beats. And I will be talking more in depth about beats in just a minute. The next method of kind of understanding 3-act structure, we're getting into ones that I haven't personally used. I find it overwhelming just looking at it, but the snowflake method is definitely popular. It's one that works for a lot of people. I've heard a lot of outliners find the snowflake method very, very useful. So that is definitely one that I recommend you look into if you're looking for additional approaches to structure. The next super popular structural guideline that I know a lot of people swear by, and you can find some great resources here on YouTube. I know there are a few author-tubers who love the Dan Harmon story circle, which in essence kind of boils down to 4-act structure, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But you basically follow this circle: comfort zone, need or desire, unfamiliar situation, adaptation, get what they wanted, but there's a price to pay, return to comfort, and then change. It's a way to approach your story structure with 8 sections if you are overwhelmed by beats, or if 3-act structure just really doesn't vibe for you. Again, I would look more in depth into resources for this method if you just looked at that and went, I kind of love that. Again, it's all about taking the bits and pieces from different places and things, that whatever it is that's gonna snap story structure and beats into place for you. Then there's also a method that Kat uses here on YouTube, Kat O'Keefe, that a lot of people love. So I'm going to link down below to her videos. Like, I've met professional writers who use Kat's system. She calls it the 27-point outlining method. And I know that she divides her story into 9 sections. And so she's got all this method to the madness. And I definitely recommend you check that out if, again, having more to follow, if you think that's going to help you. Kat is an outliner, so I feel like it's great for you super outliners. Another type to check out. But it's all divisible by 3 if you notice, so it's kind of in essence still kind of a cousin to 3-act structure. But then there are ways to break out of 3-act structure, as the Dan Harmon story circle does. 4-act structure or 5-act structure. They still have all the kind of familiar things that you expect. They're going to have inciting incidents. They're going to have midpoints. They're going to have climaxes. They're just, breaking up the story into a different number of sections using different identifiers that might, again, click things into place for you. One that I found for 4-act structure that I found interesting was the idea that Act 1 is the stable world and old ideas, then something changes, that Act 2 is an unstable world with old ideas. The character has old ideas. Then there's that realization, epiphany in the middle. You still have that midpoint, which leads to an unstable world with new ideas. And lastly, you end in the 4th act with a stable world with new ideas. What I like about this is that it's really laying out that it's about character growth and change alongside things going on, the conflict and the stakes of the world. Then, as I mentioned, I find 5-act structure, though I haven't personally used it, very attractive just because they give an entire act to one of my favorite beats. So in that one, your Act 1 is like a prologue of characters and setting, and your Act 2 would be rising conflict. This would include your inciting incident, which would lead to continued rising action into Act 3, which makes sense, to a climax point in the middle. So they're calling it a climax, but it's basically your midpoint. And then it's falling action through Act 4 into a denouement in Act 5. So this is a structure that favors a book where your climax is happening kind of between 60 and 70% if we're thinking in Kindle percentages, rather than 80 or 90%, which will happen more often in a 3-act structure. So it's just an idea of kind of shifting and moving things around a tiny bit, but not like massively. It basically moves the climax 10%, which really, you have to know your story and your genre as well. Some genres, just 3-act structure is going to work every single time. Other genres, something like 4-act structure or 5-act structure, might just better suit your story. Not every story has the big earth-shattering climax at 80%. You can have something that's between 50 and 60% and then the rest of the book is like rolling downhill. It's different structures to suit different stories. Next, I want to talk a little bit more in depth about those plot beats, largely because they were so useful for me, but also I talk about them all the time in videos, which is why I was like, you should finally formally make a video on story structure, because you keep throwing these things out there. So I'm going to go over what I consider like the big, meaty beats that you should know. Now, I think they're all important. In fact, one of my favorites is not one I'm going to talk about here. I love The Dark Night of the Soul, but these are the ones that really align well with 3-act story structure that I think are important to think about as you are approaching story structure, essentially. And as I mentioned, highly recommend Save the Cat Writes a Novel if you think that this method of approaching breaking down a story is going to click for you, because it is, honestly, I think, really good. And just a note on that plotter versus pantser divide, of course, if you are a plotter, you're gonna take a beat sheet like this and you're gonna plan it out ahead of time, thinking about story structure. But what I like about beats and how they really work for me is, as a pantser who does some planning ahead of time but just doesn't like to rigidly plan ahead of time, I like that I don't have to rigidly plan every single beat, because a couple of those little beats that I enjoy a lot, like The Dark Night of the Soul, I enjoy writing them in the moment. I don't enjoy planning them ahead of time. But the big beats I'm going to talk about are the kind of big beats that are all about conflict and stakes, that planning enough of them ahead of time gives me a road map for writing my story ahead of time, and I have the confidence knowing the core structure of my story is in place because I already know a lot of this ahead of time, but I don't plan ahead of time for the things that I find fun to write more of the seat of the pants, which are pinch points and reversals and a lot of those microbeats from the beat sheet, bad guys close in, and so on. Fun and games too. That said, that is one of the essential beats. I just don't always plan it ahead of time. So the fundamentals I think you need to know about beats. So setup / status quo before the change, which is the inciting incident. You need to do that build up. Even if it's just like a chapter or two, you need to settle the reader into that status quo before you change everything and start the journey. So the next essential beat that you will find in any story, regardless of the structure that you're following, it's an inciting incident. There's always going to be a moment of change that is the thing that propels the story forward, that makes the story happen. Though the next essential beat that you shouldn't skimp on, it's the break into two. I mentioned that decision point, when your character makes the decision to do the thing, to go on the journey. That's an important part of character agency as well as character arc. You need to actually have them making active choices and decisions that propel the plot forward. Always bearing in mind the character wants, needs, stakes, etc. So the next essential thing, and this is all just about kind of, well, it's literally called Fun and Games with the Promise of the Premise, but it's about pacing in Act 2, but also delivering to the reader what they expect from the book. It's called the Promise of the Premise for a reason. It's whatever they signed up for. So in The Hunger Games, it's The Hunger Games. Imagine if you skipped that, the reader would be like, no, I wanted, like, that's the point. You can't skip from I volunteer to Pete is betraying me in the Hunger Games. There's a lot in between there. It's all the fun stuff. It's all the build-up. It's all the juicy rising conflict. You can't skip that. Then the next just essential beat, you have to have some kind of midpoint turn. It's some sort of shift in the status quo in the middle that leads to a realization or an epiphany in the main character. It's where everything changes. The perspective on what is going on and what needs to happen changes, and it happens approximately in the middle. And then next one I've mentioned already, the break into 3. There has to be something before Act 3, before the climax. So you can't just go from midpoint turn straight into your climax. You have to have a series of things that happen. It's the rolling downhill sensation, but that lead to another decision point. But what I like to specify here is that it's not always a literal decision. It's not the character going, I will do this, though sometimes it is. Having them know what they need to do can sometimes be a part of it. But very often it's them making the wrong decision or like taking a step in one direction that maybe the character doesn't know, but the reader can see, either at the time or in hindsight, that inevitably, whatever that choice was, whatever it was that happened, inevitably propelled the main character and the story toward the climax and the ending. It's the there's no turning back moment, essentially. Which leads to the climax, the thing in Act 3, the big confrontation, everything happening. Then my favorite, the denouement. As I mentioned, a lot of things skip this. I don't like skipping this because I do actually consider it an essential beat, not one I plan ahead for, mind you, because it's all about emotions and reflection, a literal breathing moment for the character and the reader, wrapping up loose ends before you get to the finale. I like separating them because if you don't separate them, often that finale, it's either going to feel rushed or incomplete if you don't have some of those moments of reflection and resolution. And so that finale is your final beat. You need some sort of ending, and most often I skipped opening and closing image because they are technically essential, but let's not get into the weeds. But you're gonna have some sort of meaningful visual or thematic open, and very often your finale, your closing image, will have some sort of reflection on that, either in character, theme, or literal setting. So those are the big essential beats that I follow, largely influenced by the Blake Snyder beat sheet I originally followed, which was for screenwriting, but I just want to briefly read through the ones from Save the Cat Writes a Novel. Some of the verbiage is a little different that might be more helpful for anchoring you as a novel writer. I'm just really used to the other ones. So these are all the beats by act. So Act 1 is opening image, then you have theme stated, setup, catalyst, inciting incident, the debate, which leads to the break into 2, we're in Act 2 now, the B story, fun and games, midpoint, bad guys close in, all is lost, dark night of the soul. As I said, I love this moment. Then Act 3, your break into 3, your finale, and the final image. As I mentioned, slip a denouement in there. I highly recommend it before your finale. But that is the Save the Cat Writes a Novel ones. So that is a primer on 3-act structure, what it is, and the things that go into it, story beats, things to consider. Definitely an overview because there's a lot more to say about a lot of this stuff, some of which I have covered in individual videos. I've done an entire video on beginnings, basically Act 1. I've done an entire video on middles, basically Act 2, and an entire video on endings, basically Act 3. Plus I have videos on plotting thrillers that go over a lot of the same stuff. And as I mentioned, I am going to do a whole video on pinch points and reversals because they're so critical to stories, especially suspense stories, but it's definitely kind of getting into the weeds once you get to that. You want to nail and understand these kind of bigger picture, structural divides, moments, and beats before you start pulling your hair out about all of those little things, though they're little things that are pretty critically important. So definitely look for that video. Let me know down below in the comments questions that you have about 3-act structure, about story beats, or if this is your bread and butter. Do you have any favorite quick tips about story structure and plotting and beats? Drop them down below. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I will make more of these nitty-gritty craft videos, though they hurt my soul a tiny bit to make. Articulating everything, it makes me think like an outliner a little. I think that's what I kind of chafe against, but ultimately it's kind of satisfying to talk about these things. I'm structure's actually really interesting. I really like it. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.